Hello, my name's Don Wiggins. I am at the Oakland's office in Jacksonville, Florida, and welcome everyone to today's webinar on distribution. I am head of the office in Jacksonville. We have an office in Savannah, Georgia as well. Logistics distribution is one of our major areas of focus. In fact, Oakland's has industry subgroups, specialty groups, and I head up the distribution practice worldwide. This is a great time, and I'm going to introduce our guests in just a minute. But in distribution, there is a lot going on right now. When we started planning the seminar, I wrote down questions, and I came to the conclusion very quickly that an hour is not nearly enough time to cover all of the issues and opportunities moving in from 2023 to 2024. But we're going to try to hit the highlights today. And I would like to introduce special guest. This is Martin Harrell. Martin and our company have a long history, and I will let him introduce himself.
Thanks, Don. As Don said, my name is Martin Harrell. I'm the president of Beacon Waterproofing, which is a division of Beacon Building Products. Beacon Building Products is a $9 billion primarily roofing distribution company. We're a Fortune 500 company based out of Herndon, Virginia. I head up the division called Waterproofing, which is the business that I've spent most of my career in. And the easiest way to describe waterproofing is if you think of a commercial building structure, you've got a roof, and the roofing division handles that. But that building also has 5 other sides, 4 walls and a floor. We handle everything on those 4 walls and below the structure to prevent water from coming into the building, to prevent moisture, air infiltration. So we're selling caulking and sealants and epoxies, concrete repairs, anything that's going to prevent water and air and vapor moisture from coming in the building.
I'd also like to give you a very brief history of Martin and our relationship. We represented Martin and the owners of his company, Coastal Construction Products, 5 years ago?
2018. 5
years ago, when they sold to a private equity group that specializes in distribution. The private equity group grew the company along, of course, with the management team. And then 2 years ago, was it 2 years ago?
1 year.
1 year ago,
Yeah.
The private equity group sold the company, as Martin mentioned, to Beacon. So we have a long history. Martin has a lot of experience in transactions. The company, the division that he manages has about 500 million revenue, so a substantial operation, and all of that will come into our discussion today. Decisions to disruptions charting a course for distribution in 2023. Of course, we're looking at state of play right now. 2024 is just around the corner, believe it or not, less than a month away. So we'll, of course, talk about that. But really the question is, what's the state of the industry today? Because a lot has gone on in the past 5 or 6 years with transactions, with COVID, with supply chain disruption, all the things that have gone on. There are, of course, hot spots around the world. We'll touch on all of those as we go through. But, distribution to some people may not seem like a very exciting area, but there's a lot going on, and we'll talk about that. Here are the things that we're going to cover over the course of the next hour or so. We're going to talk about the global supply chain and the pressure it's undergoing, which has been tremendous, of course, during COVID and calmed down a little bit recently, still has supply chain is under pressure. We'll talk about technology advancements. I'm very interested to hear what Martin has to say about that, because there are a lot of decisions that are being made now that will affect the future course of distribution in the industry, and we'll talk about that. It's difficult. This is the decision part, difficult decisions to make in which technology route to take, what's going to actually work and what's not going to work. We'll talk about that. AI, of course, is the buzzword of the day. And the question is, what are distribution companies doing relative to AI? Current events, a lot going on around the world with the Ukraine and Russia, with the Middle East now, with China, with Mexico. There's a lot going on in Canada. There's a lot going on. We'll talk about those topics as we go through the hour as well. M&A activity, we will touch on this, and that has changed with disruptions in the financial markets. Strategic buyers such as Beacon really have become more important players. Private equity groups are still very active, but still having some difficulty in financing transactions because of the disruptions in the debt markets. We'll talk about that, and then we'll have a discussion later. I get to ask Martin questions, and you get to ask him questions too. We'll talk about these topics and anything that you'd like to ask him. There's an opportunity at the end of the hour to ask Martin questions. So here's the first slide, and it's global supply chain pressures. And you can see when the line here, the graph is above the baseline of 0, it means that the industry is under more pressure. And when it drops down below, it means less pressure. And you can see, not surprisingly, what happened back from 20 through very recently. The graph is above the line, meaning that the supply chain was under a lot of pressure. A lot of this was caused, of course, by COVID. I know our clients really had difficulty, especially if they were buying raw materials, metals, wood, building supplies, aluminum, steel. All of those areas had supply chain disruptions. And Martin and I were talking earlier, I don't know if just-in-time is dead, but it has certainly been damaged substantially because during a period where there were so many supply chain disruptions, what we observed was companies buying what they could, when they could, and in a lot of cases it resulted in excess inventory, but they had to do that to protect themselves. So supply chain under pressure now, not as much as it was in the past. I'll ask Martin what he's seen in the past 2 or 3 years as COVID has moved into the rearview mirror, what's happened with supply chain as far as his operation is concerned. Here's supply chain resilience, and I found this to be a very interesting graph. Resiliency is what are the people in the supply chain doing to adapt to change when difficulties occur, like we had 3 or 4 years ago, especially, or 2 or 3 years ago, especially. What were companies doing to protect their supply chain, to make the supply chain resilient, to get it back into reasonable order? And as you can see in this graph, the resiliency went up, and recently it's come down. I think there are a lot of factors involved in that. One is that companies had to react, had to be resilient, had to adapt during COVID. But what's happened since then, one is a lot of those efforts were made and a lot of structural changes were made. And then recently, I think with the cost of technology, with financing difficulties, in some cases, resiliency is still high, but it's come down to some extent. So I'm going to ask Martin here is what did you do in your operation during COVID to adapt to it and to make sure your supply chain did have resiliency?
It was a real challenge, primarily because the customers changed their ordering habits. So as a distributor, we like to say we buy in semi-loads and sell in pickup loads. So we are providing local inventory immediately available to the contractor so that they can do their work that day. And what changed is that contractors no longer had confidence in the manufacturer's ability to produce the material or our ability to make sure that we had the proper amount of inventory in stock for their daily needs. So they would change their ordering habits, where they may start trying to pre-plan and order a month, 2 months, 3 months in advance, but they didn't have necessarily the sophistication to plan that far in advance. The other thing they would do is over-order, which created a real challenge. If the job was going to take 100 units, they may order 150 just to ensure that they had the right amount of material on hand. The problem with that is if they don't pick up all of that material, we're now stuck with the remaining material that we need to find a new home for. And so the other part that changed is our type of contractor base usually gets very used to a typical or a particular manufacturer, and they only work with that manufacturer. They're used to the way the product works and the systems come together. And what we saw is contractors willing to use any product they could get their hands on, any product. So there was no longer the same loyalty to a manufacturer if that manufacturer couldn't produce. And then once you try a different product and get used to it, that's now your new product of choice. And so we've seen maybe not a wholesale, but we've seen a lot of shift in contractor preference of what materials they're willing to use.
We saw that too. We saw the reverse where manufacturers were loyal to customers who were good customers before and who paid on time, and didn't try to beat them up necessarily for every penny in pricing. But we saw that it really, in a lot of cases, became much more of a partnership. The customers still had to pay, don't get me wrong, they paid full price, but really it was a matter of supply, of who got the allocation of the supply. So we saw exactly the same thing. The next is, this is really, to me, probably the single most interesting topic, and that is supply chain technology advancements. As I said before, AI has become a buzzword, and AI is just an evolution. We've had artificial intelligence for a long time. Spreadsheet is artificial intelligence. I think it's just developed to the point that is really becoming a major player, a major influence. Still has a long way to go to become mature and developed, but I'll ask Martin about that in a minute, is how, if they are using in theirs. But building more resilient supply chain, we talked about that before. I think a lot of practices have changed by companies in their supply chain to make it where they have redundancies, where they have loyalties, they have relationships they develop to make their supply chain more reliable, more resilient. End-to-end supply chain visibility. This is one thing we see a lot, is we've almost gotten to the point, like, I know if I order something on Amazon, I can track it exactly where it is. And I think you probably are seeing the same thing. Is that true
Absolutely.
in your business?
Yes.
So you have visibility literally from manufacturing to delivery.
We try to have visibility, but I would say I would move it more to the customer. The customer's expectation is that they have visibility. And that's a really difficult thing from a technology standpoint to make sure we can offer them.
Yeah, Amazon has really changed the landscape, because as consumers now, if I can't get it tomorrow, I'm disappointed. When I was a kid ordering things, baseball gloves or whatever it happened to be, 6 weeks. That was the standard. Everything took 6 weeks. And now it's hours. Certainly not weeks. And I think as a society, we've come used to that, and it really causes pressure on the supply chain. The next is the constantly evolving global trade environment. Again, Martin and I were talking about this earlier. What we've seen is a lot of changes around the world. This trend has been going on a while, but we just had a client that moved all of their manufacturing from China to Vietnam. I've seen other companies literally have products shipped from China to an intermediary country where work is done on the product and shipped to the US. The idea, of course, is it won't have tariffs now, since it's been through an intermediary country. We've seen also Mexico become a bigger player because of labor cost, manufacturing ability, and closeness to the US. The logistics problem of shipping from Monterey to San Diego or Chicago are certainly not like shipping from Ningbo to those cities. So is that what you've seen?
Absolutely. I will say most of our products are manufactured in the US. They're extremely freight sensitive. So proximity to where the material is actually installed is very important. But yes, we've absolutely seen that.
Another thing we've seen is European companies coming into the US, buying in the US. And at first I thought it might be it was just an aberration that we saw one or two, but I think that's clearly a trend now. And one of the many differences in European companies and US companies is ESG. That's one of the first questions we'll get from European companies. We're doing several buy-side assignments, for example, European companies moving to the US, and that's one of the first questions we get. And I think just the conditions are that is a more at the forefront topic in Europe than it is in the US. Not that it's not considered in the US, but clearly in talking with European companies, that's one of the first questions they ask. Is that what you see?
Absolutely. Right. And those companies that are on the front end of working through that are more attractive to these European companies for sure.
Exactly. Not all US companies are sensitive to that issue. Technology and advancements. This is we talked about before, and I'm going to go ahead and ask. I mean, there are a number of listed here. I'm not going to go through each one, of course, because of time limitations. But the first one I want to ask about is AI. What are you seeing in your business? And AI, I know the term, it's just an evolution. We've just gotten to the point where that's become the buzzword to encapsulate a lot of different technologies. But what are you seeing in your company?
So I would say we're actually on the front end of our journey, the early end of our journey. We've got a conference in January of next year that's going to be for an internal conference that's going to be focused on artificial intelligence and trying to understand how we think it can bring the greatest benefit to our organization and what areas we should tackle. So I would say we're probably a month early in being able to talk about where I think we're heading. What I will say, what I have seen from the advancements that have been made is the work that typically an analyst would do to understand changes at a branch, changes in a region, changes with a manufacturer from a profitability standpoint or from a sales standpoint. And these things are now becoming automatic. You know, AI can determine those areas of inconsistencies very quickly, point them out to a manager, and you can act upon them much, much quicker. And I think that's an area that's going to influence our business dramatically moving forward and quickly. It's not going to take much time for those types of resources and tools to be put in place.
I think that's true. There was a book back in the 70s called Future Shock. And the whole point of the book was the faster things go, the faster they go. And I think that's true with AI. If you look at how fast microchips develop, how fast the speed of any technology moves is once you get over that initial inertia and it starts moving, it moves faster and faster as you go along. And I don't think there's any question that'll be true with AI, because we've all heard horror stories about lawyers, for example, using Chat GPT to write a brief, and Chat GPT makes up case sites. That's a startup cost. I think that kind of thing will happen, but as time goes by, those wrinkles will get ironed out. I don't think there's any question.
Absolutely. And I think AI will get to a point where it's doing 60 or 70% of the work for an executive, so that the executive can then use their skill set, their knowledge, and their history to really understand what that information it means to them and their business.
Well, related to this, I have a question, because we see those clients also, is how do you see not just AI, but how do you see other technologies replacing labor? You have warehouse issues, you have trucking issues. I'll risk stepping on the third rail and ask you about driverless trucks.
Right.
But also essentially warehouses that operate with automation, with picking and packaging and all of the things that you do in warehouses. What are you seeing that as the technology of replacing labor?
Well, especially as the cost of labor continue to increase, it's definitely a focus of how can you make operations more efficient? How can those trucks be running more often? Whether it's driverless or not, what are the opportunities to make them more efficient? The way to make them more efficient is to utilize them more. Same with the warehouses. How can we keep those warehouses? Do you do split shifts? Do you keep them open a little bit more? What is the technology that allows that warehouse person to pick and pack much more quickly? Usually that is directing the warehouse person exactly to the bin that they need to go to select that item. We're not at the stage of robotics or anything like that, but it's not too far off in the distant future where that could be a reality to change how those warehouse environments work.
Well, I have another question related to that, because this is what you run into back when is evolution changed in TV, VCRs, that kind of thing. There was a big controversy, or not a controversy, but a social decision we made of beta versus VCR.
Mm-hmm.
Both good technologies. They both worked. One won out. It happens. Spreadsheets. Look at how many spreadsheets there have been, and Excel won. How do you, as an executive, decide which technology? You've got a decision, you've got a problem to be solved, and you've got three technologies that could possibly solve the problem. How do you make that decision?
Well, first of all, I think my history with distribution is we do not have to be on the leading edge. As an industry, we are able to follow some other industries and see what they have done. I would also say for good decision making, it's groupthink. It's getting the right people in a room who understand the needs of the business, to understand what these tools are, and then debating and debating and debating what is the right tool for the business and where we think it's going. And you're not always going to get it right, but it's really important to have that group think to understand what's right for the business.
Yeah, that to me is one of the hardest decisions is, when you, especially the time now when technology is evolving, which horse do you bet on? Okay, we have some others. Risk management, business continuity. I know that's become much more important, especially when you go through something like COVID. I think obviously a lot of negatives on COVID, but I think it did force us to make some decisions. Think about how many video calls you've been on in the past month compared to 5 or 10 years ago. I know we already talked about some of the supply chain disruptions caused, and no question, a lot of companies make better decisions now. So how do you make that decision? Risk management, business continuity. How do you plan for that?
You do a lot of scenario planning of what could go wrong. I think the one thing that COVID taught us is that if something can go wrong, it will. And that it's not good enough to say that'll never happen. Those black swan events do happen. I think again, one of the things about distribution, we've come from such a lower tech environment that we can fall back on practices that worked for us a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades ago. So for example, in all of our branches, we can go to a manual paper ticket system within seconds. We have the ability to just go back in time and do everything in paper. We have the ability to find the material in the warehouse based on a paper solution and be able to serve our customers. It may take longer, may not be as efficient, may not be as where we want to operate, but we do have the ability to do that. Scenario planning is really, really important. Running through those types of, when you think of cybersecurity, running through those types of events and how would you react? How does the executive team react? But how do the branches react based on that scenario happening? Because that's really where the business gets done.
I have another question too on technology, because one of the key factors in running a company, especially when you have technology, the ability to analyze data. The question is, how do you get the data? How do you ensure that data actually gets entered into the system? I know that's one of the toughest questions that we have, one of the toughest issues that we have. For example, in ours, it's everybody using a CRM.
Right.
How do you ensure compliance, and what do you do? I know it's a painful process, but how do you do it?
Well, I would say it's a couple different things. When you think of a sales order, there's no room for error, right? You've got to get the information into the sales order correctly, and that includes the actual item, that includes the number of units that are sold, and that includes pricing and costing that's done accurately. When you think of something like a CRM, to me, that's culture. That is having to influence your organization and explain why this information is important, explain the expectations of everyone in the organization, what their role is in collecting that information, and what we expect the outcome to be. They can't just go into a black hole that the employees don't understand. Why am I adding this information in if I don't ever see the outcome? So to me, that's more of a cultural shift, and it's important work.
It really is, because you got salespeople who are not noted for their attention to detail always. They want to sell. You have, I know we run into this with manufacturing clients. They have employees that are not used to entering all the information and capturing that data. And it's an ongoing decision, because if you make decisions based on data, the decisions are only as good as the data you have.
Well, and sometimes it's making a decision to staff around that person. If they're a terrific salesperson and they're really bad at loading data, maybe they don't need to be the one inputting the data. Maybe there's a way to staff around that.
That's a really smart point, because I think one thing we've seen, especially in large organizations, is the sales don't have the support that the person who's good at sales, like you said, is not necessarily the person good at paying attention to detail. And we both have some painful experience on that.
Yes.
Supply chain technology, this is something that's really, we talked a little bit about it earlier, but with what's going on in the world now, with the hotspots we have, we'll talk more about this later. We're anticipating a question. And you said that you primarily source in the US, so this is not an issue for you, but around the world, you got hotspots, you got labor issues in Canada, you have all sorts of issues in China, both domestic and in international relations, Taiwan, droughts, floods, the COVID. You have issue in the Middle East. Now we have two hotspots in the Middle East, not just, well, I'm not sure if you call Ukraine Russia, Middle East, but it certainly affects Middle East because they travel through the Bosphorus to get out of the Black Sea. But you've also now got the issue in Israel, and just yesterday, I'm sure you saw there was an attack not only on commercial ships but on an American warship. Right. Does this affect you? I mean, it seems like it would, at least to some extent, because of raw material supplies. But what do you see?
That's exactly what I was going to say. While most of our products are manufactured in the U.S., raw materials come from all over the world. And yes, we absolutely could see that as an impact. Most of our manufacturers are running global organizations. So when something happens around the world that has a negative impact on them, it will have an impact on us in the US. So we're not insulated from it. It may take a little bit longer to catch up with us, but we're certainly not insulated from it.
Yep. All right, let's talk about this is some more of the technology, and I think we've talked about these, the complexity, the global supply chains become more complex. Technology makes things work a lot better if the technology works, but also means there's startup issues and maintenance issues, labor issues. I know in warehousing, I'm sure you've had that, in trucking, I'm sure you've had it. But there are a number of issues. The supply chains have just become more complex. And let's talk about some of the others. What about the ESG? We mentioned that earlier.
Right.
Do you see that becoming more important in the U.S.? We already know in other areas around the world, it is already a major focus. What about in the U.S.?
You know, I've been an executive in a public company for just over 1 year, and I've done several investor conferences, and I can tell you that this comes up in every single investor conference that I participate in. ESG is becoming a much more important a part of our daily lives and the way we think and the way we organize our business. The products that we sell, both on the waterproofing side and the roofing side, primarily used in restoration. A lot of it's not just new construction. And the way we think about restoration is it is more environmentally friendly. It is better for our landfills. It's better for the environment if we are rehabbing existing facilities versus building new. The second area that I see it is in the chemicals that are used in our types of products have changed. They've changed and evolved dramatically, especially over the last decade, which is important for us to be aware of those changes so that we can educate our contractors on those different products and the ways they're going to react because they're different. And contractors that are used to using something, they're used to it performing a certain way. Well, suddenly they've taken chemical out that changes the way it's going to work. And it's important for us to be able to educate the contractor and the end user on that.
That's what we see here. The experience is exactly the same as ours. Some of the current events we've talked about, West Coast dock strike in Canada, which has now been ostensibly resolved, thankfully. Then some others. This is one that's really a hot topic, and that's the debate over Taiwan. The question is, what are the Chinese designs on Taiwan? Are they willing to take the risk? I'll tell you my personal opinion. I think that chance has gone down with the Russia-Ukraine war because the Chinese have seen the world impose sanctions on Russia. Those would be very painful, both for in the Chinese situation for the countries imposing the sanctions as well as the Chinese receiving the sanctions. What do you see? Does that affect your business at all?
It does, again, it doesn't impact our business directly, but because we are relying on manufacturers that are running global businesses, it would absolutely have an impact. And again, it's delayed, but it could have an impact, and it's definitely something that we watch.
Yeah, if you look at where chips are manufactured around the world, the high-end chips are manufactured in Taiwan, lower-end chips in China. So if there was a major disruption from the Taiwan sourcing, then that would cause major disruptions in all sorts of high-end, not just computers, but medical devices. A lot of others, the middle-level chips are not manufactured in China either, or not in Taiwan, primarily around the world. But that's just one example of if something happens in Taiwan, that's going to have a domino effect on the rest of the world. We already have a chip shortage. That came about during COVID, where you couldn't get a refrigerator, you couldn't get all sorts of products that incorporate chips into them. And if there were an issue in Taiwan, that would definitely get a lot worse. The Israel-Hamas conflict, we just talked about this. It's already causing disruptions in the Mediterranean. And we'll have to see how that's resolved. But even as late as yesterday, as I said, we've had an escalation of attacks that apparently came from Yemen, the attacks on the commercial and U.S. warships. But this is really a hot spot that has yet to be resolved. And I think the longer it goes, the more impact it's going to have, because at least it's going to disrupt operations in the Med. Panama Canal drought. This is something you don't really think about, but shipping through the Panama Canal, you say, well, that's the ocean. What's a drought going to impact on having the ocean? But it does have an impact on fresh water in Panama that's used in lifting ships through the locks. So a drought in Panama actually does affect international shipping, and it does cause a problem. Labor is always an issue around the world now. So that's another issue with Panama Canal, especially now that you've got expanded with Panamax ships. It's become much more important. Well, let's talk about M&A. I know that your company is very acquisitive. You were acquired.
Yes.
And that hasn't stopped. But if you look at the slide here in M&A activity, what you see is it's still relatively strong, although there is somewhat of a downward trend. And what we're seeing in the market is private equity groups are still active. There's still a lot of money on the sidelines, but deals are definitely taking longer. Multiples have not changed that much. They may have softened slightly, but we have not seen that. But another big factor we're seeing in M&A activity is the availability of financing. We do a lot of work with private equity groups, just like when we originally sold Martin's company, it was to a private equity group. But now what we're running into, and I've had many PE groups tell us that 5 years ago, 3 years ago, they would have 20 or 25 financing sources that would be a potential to finance a deal. Now it's 3 to 5. So that's what we're seeing. Of course, the cost of money has gone up as interest rates have gone up. A natural impact of that is financing will be softening, and multiples will be softening as well. So it's much more difficult to get financing, and also a little bit of softening in the multiples. But as you can see through this, activity is still good, a little bit of a downward trend. The question is, what do you think will happen next year? This is one of the most uncertain environments I've seen. And I can argue either way of what will happen next year. This is going to be a soft landing. The economy is going to turn around, interest rates coming down, all it's going to be right with the world, or it's going to be a disaster. Financing is going to continue to be hard to get. What do you see? This is an easy question. What do you think is going to happen next year?
Well, I would say part of my opinion is influenced by the niche of distribution that I'm in, and I mean waterproofing, not roofing. the waterproofing space is consolidating and consolidating very quickly. And Beacon has what I would call first mover advantage, having acquired multiple companies in this space over the last 5 years. So I think we expect the M&A activity to continue in our industry over the next year or two. We feel like it's an opportune time to buy. I would say on a more holistic level, what I see in distribution is a lot of consolidation in multiple industries. You have a lot of first generation entrepreneurs who, if they don't have a strategy to transition the business to a second generation of either family or management, they're starting to look for, how am I going to exit this business? And we're seeing more and more of that. And if you don't have a plan in place, there are people that are starting to get nervous. And I think between COVID, supply chain challenges that came right after COVID, and now the international conflict that we're seeing, sort of wrapping all this conversation together, there are people that are nervous about their business and where it's going to go, and they're looking to be part of a bigger organization, seeking safety and security in that larger organization.
Exactly. The single biggest mistake we see people make in thinking about selling their company is lack of preparation, is not preparing to enter into the biggest economic transaction in all likelihood of their life. Here's some others. I'm not going to spend time going through all of the transactions, but the point of this is there's still a lot of activity. This is the first half of the year, and you can see there are large transactions, small transactions, but the market is still active, but some softening, but it certainly has not reached anywhere the levels we got back in the early 2000s or 2008, 9. We have not reached that at all. Here, people are always interested in multiples, and I thought this was a very interesting graph because you can see that multiples have overall to some extent softened, although it depends on what segment you're in. If you look at some of the segments here, they are relatively strong and have maintained their level of multiples. This is enterprise value to EBITDA. This is the most common multiple that people use in transactions to shortcut a lot of other types of valuation metrics. But enterprise value to EBITDA, an EBITDA multiple, you see that it's softened. But one thing I thought that was the most interesting point here is the different industry segments have coalesced. If you look back at the early part of this graph, the first part of it, there's a substantial difference in industry segment. But if you look at the end recently, those have coalesced. You would expect that in EBITDA multiples. Look at the next graph, which is revenue multiples, similar pattern, except they haven't coalesced, which you expect. But some of the segments were higher. This is enterprise value to revenue or revenue multiples. And this is going to depend. The reason there's such disparity among the industry segments is profit margin. Because if you have, an 8% bottom line EBITDA margin versus a 12%, you're going to get perhaps a similar EBITDA multiple, but a substantially different revenue multiple. So the pattern is generally similar, but I thought the one on the EBITDA multiples was really interesting because they've coalesced to a very narrow range. Here is, I thought the interesting part of this graph was stock price returns for distribution and logistics. One is what you can see is they're pretty strong, but I thought the most interesting part of this graph is if you look at the S&P 500, logistics and distribution is generally above the return of the S&P. So it's a very strong segment. I think the numbers are that logistics account for about 14% of GDP in the world. So that's big.
Substantial.
I mean, you look, that's a sixth or a seventh of the economy. So it's not just manufacturing, it's not just consuming it. You got to get from one place to the other, and that is a big part of the economy. So what we're going to do for the rest of the hour, and I've asked a lot of these questions, as I said, when I started putting the questions together to talk with Martin, it just, I kept coming up with ideas. But the first question I had, we've talked about a lot of these, but what do you see what is your major challenge? I won't ask you the old question of what keeps you up at night.
Right.
But what's your major challenge?
Labor continues to be a major challenge for us. Finding the right labor with the skill set that we need I think I have 5 or 6% open recs right now, open positions right now, some going back 90 to 120 days. We just continue to struggle with finding the right labor.
And is that across the board? Is that everywhere from the warehouse through management?
It's primarily in the warehouse, but it is across the country. It's primarily in the warehouse and drivers.
Yeah, we see that machine operators, drivers, warehouse. It's just very difficult.
I would say I would actually characterize it as also the entry level positions. When you just mentioned the size and significance of distribution in the GDP, the reality is folks coming out of college today aren't seeking a distribution position. No one in college is telling them about this exciting industry, the fact that it's a significant part of the economy, and that there's significant career growth opportunity in that. And so we're not as seen as an attractive industry, and we're trying to influence and change that.
Well, we have many corporate sayings in our company, and one of them is there's an inverse relationship between glamour and cash flow.
Yeah.
And we just see that over and over and over again. If you look at, entertainment or sports, a lot of glamour, a lot of excitement, but very difficult industries. But you see, some of the more blue collar, what you say might not be exciting. It depends on how you look at it. I can tell you, for us, logistics and distribution is very exciting.
Absolutely.
But also, I will say, at least 2 universities that I've been associated with in the past and still am, both have developed logistics programs, very, very strong logistics programs. So I think that message is getting out that it's a great industry, it's a great field to develop in, and so that's one thing we are seeing. We'll see how that turns out in the future if it produces enough. But the labor issue is one we see.
We're doing our best to promote the industry for sure.
What else? Any other major industries? I know we talked about technology. I know that's a big hot button.
I think in general, consolidation. So whether it's consolidation at the manufacturer level, consolidation at my level as a distributor, or consolidation at our customer level, the size of the manufacturers that we're dealing with is only getting larger and larger and larger, and the same with our customers. I think there's a shift in our industry right now where we're still trying to shake out who the alpha dogs are, and it's just that it does keep me up at night because it's changing so much and so quickly.
Yeah, that's something. Change is moving faster. And summarize, if you would, we've talked about this a little bit, but summarize the 2 or 3 structural changes in logistics that have resulted from COVID. Structural changes.
One of the primary ones is actually how we serve our customers. So we're traditionally a will call business. Customers will show up at our office first thing in the morning. They'll pick up the materials that they need for the day. They'll go apply them that day. And same group of people, same customer base will be back the very next morning to pick up the goods that they need for that day. One of the things that COVID taught us, especially when we weren't allowing people into our buildings, is the ability to do that will call where they don't even need to come in. So one of the things that's changed is all of our parking lots actually have numbered parking spaces now. And customer will call in their order, and we will tell them park in slot number 3, or they'll say they're in slot number 3. We're actually bringing the material directly to them. They're signing the ticket. They may or may not ever actually go inside the building. That's a structural change that we hope adds value because it gets them on the road much quicker. They also trust that if they call their order in, we'll have it pre-staged, pulled, and ready to load them up and get them out the door. So the business has actually changed from the showroom more into the warehouse. So that's been a structural change. I would say the second major change that's happened is the expectation from our manufacturers of how far in advance we will place our orders. So our order and shipping time with one of our primary vendors used to be a 5-day lead time. We've now extended that to 6 months. They want 6 months notice into our supply chain of what we expect our orders to be. That was a massive shift for us to change the way we think about inventorying in order to get the manufacturer the data they needed to be able to rely on.
That's interesting because in your industry, in your business, it is construction. So you do have some idea of what's coming, what's in the works, what's in the pipeline. You got to feel sympathetic for a lot of industries that just don't have that. I mean, literally their demand is day to day, and it just makes it much harder for them. So they couldn't live with a 6-month lead time.
It's hard on us, I assure you, but yes, we do have more insight than a typical industry.
A building, you're not going to impulse build a building today.
Correct.
It's going to be planned, and so you have a little bit of forecasting a building, but a lot of industries it's become more of a problem. Another one we see is 10 years ago, 15 years ago, virtual meetings were almost non-existent. And my personal rule of thumb is a virtual meeting is about 75% as effective as actually being there. And I think that's been another structural change from COVID, that in a lot of people complain about virtual meetings, but I can tell you, I think most people would agree. In a lot of cases, it's a much better alternative to getting in the car or getting on a plane to go to the meeting.
I think the ability to get subject matter experts from all over the country, or frankly, all over the world, like this type of call, onto a call for 30 minutes or an hour to help solve a problem has been an absolute game changer. I don't like the virtual meetings as we bring our team together. We had to do that a couple of times for annual sales meetings. I don't like that because I don't think it builds culture. But when you're dealing with a problem or an opportunity and you can grab people from all over, it just makes scheduling easier. You get collaborative thinking. There are aspects of it that I absolutely love.
Yeah, and you get to leverage your time. You think about with telemedicine, for example.
Yes.
You can leverage expertise of the top experts in the world, and they can treat a patient in the jungles of South America. I mean, it really has leveraged, and it's made it where people are much more accepting.
Mm-hmm.
We've just seen that. I know you have too. Is people are just much more willing. Now I have literally, I'm sure you have too, been on a call, and I'm talking to someone in Chicago, get off the call, and I'm talking to someone in Hamburg or Tokyo. I mean, just really makes it much easier and more efficient. You may not be fully as efficient as in person, but you got to get there, and that's the problem.
Well, and COVID forced all of us to embrace the technology, which I think about the way my granddaughter communicates with her grandparents is totally different than it may have happened pre-COVID.
We talked a little bit about AI earlier.
Yes.
How are you in your company? How are you using AI? Are you using it now?
We're not using it.
And what do you see next year and the next year?
Yeah, so we're not using it yet. We're at the very beginning of our journey. How I see it being used, one is how can we get ahead of what we think a customer's expectations are going to be? So, for example, if they're ordering this product on this project, and we know the stage of that project, we should be able to have better insight into understanding what are the other products that are about to come. Typically, a construction project for our type of construction could last anywhere from 12 to 24 months. So having advanced notice in that construction cycle would be really, really helpful. Again, I mentioned it earlier. I think that the ability for AI to spot inconsistencies, changes in the business from a sales standpoint, from a profitability standpoint, point those out to a manager, an executive, so that further research can be done, I think will be a real game changer.
Well, looks like we've got some questions. We got about 10 minutes left to go. We've got a few questions from people outside. You and I have asked each other enough questions. Let's see what they say. How do you forecast market demand and plan your inventory accordingly, especially given seasonality and cyclicality. I know you're in a cyclical business.
Yes.
Is your business also seasonal?
It is. As we've expanded, it's become seasonal. We were always for most of my career, we were a Florida-based company, and we were not very seasonal. But as we've grown, yes, we've become seasonal. Demand planning tools help you with the seasonality. From a cyclicality standpoint, we're tracking open orders that are out there. We're tracking leading indicators from in our industry niche. We're typically trying to inventory around 60, 70 days of inventory on hand at any time. So we can react pretty quickly to those changes as we see them coming. Is it perfect? No, but it's something that we're constantly working on and constantly tweaking.
That goes back to that data gathering. Again,
Absolutely.
you got to have accurate input to get accurate output. The next one is this is a good one. How do you address customization or specialization? You know, everybody wants the product customized their own particular needs.
Yep.
How do you address that, especially in an operation as large as yours? You know, the larger you are, the more difficult it is to do that. How do you do that?
So I'm going to give you probably not the answer you're expecting. We have seen customization actually go backwards in our industry because of the supply chain challenges that happened in 2021. Customers got used to using whatever they could get their hands on. So, for example, in my industry, package sizing is a big deal. Contractors like different types of packaging. The manufacturers have really reduced the number of packaging types they go to in order to reduce their number of SKUs, and the contractors have evolved and accepted that. Color choice is a big deal in my industry from an aesthetic standpoint, and people have had to adapt to fewer color choices to select from because the manufacturers are not making the color choices that they used to. So we've seen a manufacturer that used to have 30 colors of this one particular sealant now may only offer 8. Or if you want a special color, there's not only a lead time, but a significant upcharge. And then the building owner or contractor have to decide whether they're willing to pay that upcharge. So it's actually gone the opposite direction for us.
The next one is a good one. We talked a little bit earlier about a lot of times during COVID, the manufacturers who got product, the ones that had really good relationship with their suppliers.
Yeah.
How do you do that? I mean, a lot of businesses ultimately are about relationships. I know that's, you know, a cliche, but it's true.
Right. It is.
It really is true.
Yeah.
And so how do you go about really establishing those strong relationships with your input, your suppliers, your logistics providers, all the vendors you use?
Well, I would say philosophically, we view our manufacturers as partners, and we're going to partner the best with those manufacturers who also view us as a partner. We are their sales feet. We are their local sales feet on the street. We are their locally available inventory. So if we can create those partnerships, which means you have to be able to trust in one another, you have to be able to dream together, and you have to be able to share information, and that's part of the trust. If you have those relationships and you're able to talk through the business challenges, work through them, then you're going to be, let's call it a more trusted partner than maybe your competitor. So we have historically always focused on having deep relationships at all levels with our manufacturers and trying to build that relationship of being a trusted partner. The same goes for our customer base. We try and work hard to have those valued partnership relationships with customers. We don't have them with everybody. We don't have them with every vendor, and we don't have them with every customer. But those relationships do matter when the chips are down.
Okay, well, the next question is one, it's a good one because the product you sell, you're not the only company in the world that sells it.
Correct.
So you have branded differentiation, but how do you differentiate yourself from competitors?
So
why would I come to you,
yeah,
you know, as a customer as opposed to somebody across the street?
So it's funny, we've hit on a couple of these things. We look at our value proposition as 3 things. One, we have the most technical sales team in the industry, bar none. So if you have an application that is tricky, and you talk to either our inside sales team or our outside sales team, we're going to be able to find you an answer, the answer and the correct answer. That's critically important. Our customers' livelihoods are installing this material. They need it to work, or they're going to be put in a warranty situation where they have to come back and reinstall it. And nobody wants that. So the customer has to trust that when they ask a question, they're going to get the right answer every single time. Then you need to be able to back it up with inventory. A lot of our competition, they absolutely have access to these materials, but it's typically in a catalog. It's page 40 of this catalog, or it's on this, in today's world, it's on this part of their website, but they may not actually know about it, and they may not actually have it in inventory. They have access to it. Access versus immediate availability are two very, very different things. And then the third thing, which we just spent a lot of time touching on, is we want to be a trusted partner for our customers. So we want to be able to provide a technical resource to them, provide immediate availability of inventory to them, and we want to be a trusted partner for them.
Good answer, and it's easy to say and hard to do.
Always.
Yeah, but I have another question. This is more specific. I've been doing M&A for 30 years or so, and it was like when I was teaching. I used to, for a lot of people don't know me who are on the call, on the webinar, but I used to be a university professor. And in teaching for a long time, I always remembered my best students and my worst students. And your company stands out to me. Guess which one?
I hope one of the best.
It is actually, in dealing with hundreds of companies, there are three that leap to mind that had really good management teams. And I can tell you, in a transaction, it is extremely valuable from our standpoint of advising on selling to tell a buyer, management's in place, they're great, you got depth, you got more than one person who, if it came to it, could run the company. And you did a great job of building a management team that had exactly those characteristics. How'd you do that?
Well, I don't know that I can actually take credit for it. I think the founders of our business need credit for that. Our business was originally founded in 1975, and the two founders started their retirement planning in around 2009 or 2010, and they were willing to invest in two management teams. So not only were they paying themselves, but they were paying me and ultimately my two other business partners. So three people took the position that two founders had. They did a really nice job of understanding the strengths and weaknesses we each brought to the business and offsetting those. The other thing they did is they created a very slow transition plan for the organization. So my team really started leading the business in 2010. We were not officially named as, the transition was not officially done until 2012. And when I was named at that time CEO of the business, the organization, it was just well, of course he is. He's been running the business for 2.5 years because I was the face of the organization. So it created a very smooth transition. But I would say the willingness for the first generation to invest in management of the second generation, invest in the talent, invest in the time, invest in the risk that comes along with letting management make some mistakes and do things on their own. It took patience, but it was the right thing to do.
Well, it paid off. I can tell you from having worked with hundreds of companies, it really paid off. And you and the previous generation, to be congratulated on that. With that, we'll wind up. We have run out of time, unfortunately. Got a lot more questions for Martin, but I really want to say how much I appreciate his being here today. It's a big chunk of the day out of someone who's running a $500 million operation. But he was kind enough and generous enough to come and spend some time with us today. I hope it's been useful for all of you who are on the webinar. And if you do have any questions, you can direct them. You can direct them to me. I'm sure Martin would be happy to answer any as well. So with that, I will say thank you very much and really enjoyed the webinar.